Namaste. My name is Naveen Bale, and in today's video, I'm going to be speaking about Ganesha. I am an independent researcher of Hinduism, and I have been researching ancient creation myths for quite some time. Ganesha's creation is very interesting because it not only speaks to how humans are actually created, the biology of fertilization and embryology, but it also speaks to something much more. It speaks to the development of the human brain as an infant transitions from the mother's womb to its external environment. So in this video, I'm going to be first telling you about the creation myth of Ganesha. I'm then going to speak about why Ganesha's face represents the human brain. And after that, I'm going to be walking you through why Parvati's creation of Ganesha represents an infant growing in the mother's womb for 9 months, and why Parvati giving him the breath of life represents the infant's first breath. And after all of that, I'm going to wrap it all up by speaking about Ganesh Chaturthi, which is today, by the way. So happy Ganesh Chaturthi if you're watching this on the day that I release it. So let's get started and first speak about Ganesha's creation. How was Ganesha created? And so let me just set the scene. Shiva and Parvati, his wife Parvati, are living in Kailash, and they have a house there. At some point, Shiva leaves the house. The reason is debated, but mostly because Shiva is going for his meditation. So Parvati is alone at her house, and she is conflicted for a few reasons. One, she wants to take a bath, but she needs someone to protect the house. And two, she's also speaking with her other friends, and they say, Shiva has so many attendants or ganas. Parvati, why don't you have a gana? Parvati thinks about it, and she's like, why don't I have a gana? And so what she does is she begins to create a human or a gana. And she takes the turmeric paste and the other pastes which are made of prithvi from her body, and she molds them into the form of a human. Once she molds this earth element into the form of a human, it's inert. It's not conscious yet. So what does she do? She breathes life into him. She gives this clay prana. Prana is life force. It's a vata, vayu. It's the nervous system of our whole body that just flows through our body like wind. So after she does this, she has this conscious human being. She's just created life with her own hands. And so she tells Ganesha, this new infant, she instructs him, protect this house and don't let anyone enter. And Ganesha says, okay. So Parvati goes away for her bath, and there's Ganesha protecting this house. In the meantime, Shiva returns from his meditation, and Shiva sees this boy who he doesn't recognize, and he says, let me in. Ganesha denies him entry because his mom told him not to let anyone in, even Shiva. And Shiva is furious at this point. So Shiva sends all his ganas to first try to convince Ganesha, but once he just denies it outright, they have this huge battle. And by the way, you can read about all this in the Shiv Puran, and I'll have a link in it in the description because the story is pretty phenomenal. So Ganesha denies entry into Parvati's house, and there's this huge battle which Ganesha emerges victorious in. And at this point, the Devas come, Vishnu is there, they're all trying to convince Ganesha, they battle Ganesha. Ganesha and Vishnu have a fight. And at the end of it, Shiva uses his trishul, his trident, and he cuts off Ganesha's head. He beheads him. And when Parvati finds out that her creation has been killed by her husband, she is furious. And so she unleashes her wrath. She initiates the dissolution of the universe. And all the ganas are frightened about what is to come with Parvati's wrath. At this point, in order for Shiva to pacify her anger, he tells his ganas, go and find the first animal that is facing north and bring me its head. And there's a few variations of the story. The one that I'm reading right now, it says that Shiva instructs his ganas to travel north and get the first animal and bring him back. But anyways, they do this and they find an elephant. And they bring the elephant's head they put it on to Ganesha's beheaded body. And then Shiva breathes life into him. Shiva gives him prana. And that's how Ganesha is formed. Ganesha, who has this head of an elephant, that's how he's formed. And so yeah, there's the story. If you want to really understand the story, read the story, ponder over the nuances, then I encourage you to read the Shiv Puran directly. It's not as intimidating as it may seem. It's online, it's free. Definitely have a read of it if you want to get a better understanding of the story. So now let's talk about some of the interpretations of this. The first interpretation that we're going to talk about is how Ganesha may represent the human brain. If you look at the image of an elephant, which I have a book over here, if you look at Ganesha, his face is very visually similar to that of an elephant. Now, if we open this book, and this book is by Dr. Tony Nader. He's a neuroscientist from MIT who joined the Transcendental Meditation Organization, and he has just made so many of these discoveries, and he's written tons of books that Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, he entrusted the organization under his leadership. And so, respect to Dr. Tony Nader for all of his work. This is one of his views, and I truly think it's very interesting. He says, the ventral view of the brain, we see a clear correspondence between Ganesha, the pons, medulla, and cerebellum. The ears of Ganesha correspond to the cerebellum. The face of Ganesha corresponds to the pons. The trunk of Ganesha corresponds to the medulla. The eyes of Ganesha correspond to the roots of the trigeminal nerves. The tusks of Ganesha corresponds to the nerves at the base of the pons. There's this visual similarity with the bottom-up cross-section of the brain. And you may be wondering, well, you just pulled out this bottom-up cross-section of the brain out of nowhere. Well, no. Read the story. In the story, it is very clear that when Shiva beheads Ganesha, he does take a bottom-up cross-section of his brain. He does slice his head. And only after he slices his human head does Ganesha get an elephant head. Similarly, only after you take a cross-section of the brain does the view of Ganesha appear. Does the view of an elephant's head appear. And this analogy makes perfect sense, especially if you consider all the other properties of Ganesha. Ganesha is the lover of intelligence. He is the god of wisdom. He is someone you pray to overcome obstacles. Let me read what I wrote. Let me read what I wrote about him, because I feel like I was in the flow when I wrote it. Underlying all these myths is the simple fact that Ganesha represents the human brain, but not just any brain. It is a brain of a Jivan Mukti yogi, an enlightened individual who is so intelligent the ancients depicted him with an elephant head, which has a brain 3.5 times larger than a human brain. By the way, elephants are very smart. They're very intelligent. Their memories are incredible. And you can look up all of that online. Ganesha is a brain that received the Mahabharata from sage Vyasa and inscribed it for 3 years. He detached his left tusk, modifying the left side of his brain to enable this divine experience. And so there's a lot of other analogies and metaphors that we can talk about that relates to Ganesha's brain, but we'll leave that for another time. Let's move on and speak about Ganesha and embryology. How was Ganesha created? Because molding a human from earth and blowing life into that has nothing to do with how humans are actually created. But you need to realize that when we read ancient scriptures, you need to understand how they use metaphors, how they use stories in order to convey real life events. And so when you look at how a human is actually created, how does it work? Sexual reproduction. Then an embryo develops in the mother's womb for 9 months. And at the time of birth, the infant has its first gasp of air, that first cry. And this is a pivotal moment in an infant's life, because it not only gives it independence in terms of its respiratory and circulatory system, but its conscious experience of the world changes completely from this comfortable environment, this isolated, inert environment of the mother's womb. It enters the external world. And it has this sensory overload where it has vision for the first time. It can hear sounds, feels touch, Of course, these are all senses that are also active in the mother's womb, but there is sensory overload during this time. And because of this sensory overload, there's this rapid development of synapses in the human brain. So in not only the first hour and days, but the weeks and months after, the infant's brain undergoes rapid development. So let's talk about the metaphors now. Parvati molding Ganesha from clay. That represents the development of an embryo in the mother's womb, as its features become more defined over time. Parvati giving Ganesha this breath of life, this prana, not only represents how consciousness develops in the mother's womb, but also represents the infant's first breath. This remarkable transition of an infant's conscious experience because of the introduction of prana and vayu. So now, once Parvati molds Ganesha, gives him the breath of life, and after all the wars, what happens? Ganesha's head changes from a human head to an elephant head. So we clearly see this transition, this development of the brain after Ganesha's birth. And it's quite a remarkable story. One thing that I need to mention is, the whole motif of Parvati molding Ganesha and giving him the breath of life. That's shared in a lot of ancient cultures. I'm talking about Genesis. I'm talking about Greek mythology, where Prometheus molds humans out of water and earth, and Athena breathes life into the clay figures. I'm talking about Maori myths from New Zealand. I'm talking about myths from Madagascar, the Oroma from Ethiopia, Yoruba from West Africa, the Ojibwe and Potawatomi from Native America, the Navajo people, the Hopi, goes all the way to Chile, the Mapuche, the Nagabe from Panama, the Guarani from South America. This myth of creating humans by molding earth and giving them the breath of life is everywhere, all over the world. And from what we know from Ganesha, more research needs to be done, but we can in some ways extrapolate this to other places, where the development of a human by first molding it represents the development of an embryo in the mother's womb. And this breath of life represents the infant's first breath that transforms its conscious experience. And there's that. So now let's talk about Ganesh Chaturthi. I have a few thoughts, okay? Ganesh Chaturthi as a festival, it relates to the birth and the death of Ganesha. Of course, not an ordinary death. It's moksha. It is liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. And the way that our ancestors communicated Ganesha's death is quite beautiful. So the festival starts off with the birth of Ganesha, that we already know involves molding clay, doing a pran pratishtha, giving him pran. So this idol that we have is considered an actual living entity called Ganesha. Now, because of this video, we know that this process really represents the development of an embryo in the mother's womb as its features become more defined and the infant's first breath. And if we skip all the way to the end, what happens in the ritual is you take the Ganesha idol and you submerge it in water. You submerge this idol in water. But what does this really mean? In order to understand this, I need to give you a little bit of a background on Sankhya philosophy and other creation myths from across the globe. In Sankhya philosophy, there's an unmanifested state and a manifested state. During the creation of the universe, this unmanifested state that's timeless, undifferentiated, formless, it transforms into a manifested state. And this transition we know today as the Big Bang. And the singularity transforms into the world that we currently live in. Now, the ancient Indians, they viewed the world very similar to human life. Because in addition to having a birth, a creation, there is also a dissolution, a death that occurs, where we return to where we came from. So when you look at the Visarjan of Ganesha, It's really about this molded Ganesha, we're returning it to earth by placing it into water, after which it just dissolves. So yeah, there's this comparison between the life and death of a human and the life and death of the universe. The end part of the Ganesha Chaturthi is about this period of death, when manifested creation returns to this unmanifested potential. So there's that. That's one part of it. Now, if you look at ancient creation myths across the world, this unmanifested potential that exists before creation and after dissolution is represented by these chaotic waters, this formless void, this undifferentiated sea that just pervades existence. And I think that directly relates to this unmanifested state. So as it relates to Ganesha's Visarjan, the water that we put Ganesha into is this unmanifested state. Ganesha dissolving in this water represents the transition of manifested state to an unmanifested state. And if you incorporate actual Sankhya philosophy, it represents the detachment of awareness and the material world. And when awareness and the material world are detached, the material world transitions from a manifested state to an unmanifested state. That concludes my talk about Ganesha. So just to conclude this video, we've discussed the story of Ganesha's creation. We've talked about why Ganesha represents the human brain. We've talked about how Parvati creating Ganesha by molding earth and then giving him the breath of life represents this 9-month development of an embryo in the mother's womb, as well as the first breath after birth. And finally, we've talked about how Ganesha Chaturthi is a ritual that encapsulates the birth and the death of Ganesha. So in this video, I've actually left out quite a bit about Ganesha. I haven't told you all the metaphors just because it would be very long, but I will maybe make a part 2 of this video and explain all of that as well. I've been working on decoding mythology for quite some time now, and I'm beginning this process of sharing my stuff. So it would really mean the world to me if you subscribe to this channel, you write your comments on what you think, good or bad, suggestions, critiques, everything. But yeah, thank you and happy Ganesh Chaturthi.